The bye weeks are already here. No David Montgomery or Jahmyr Gibbs. Saquon Barkley is gone. Tony Pollard and J.K. Dobbins are out as well this week. Who are we going to fill in for them? Do we have enough running back depth? This may be the most important running back video that you watch so far this season. Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? The buys are already starting up, and we are going to be missing several key fantasy contributors this week, including 3 guys that are inside the top 12 fantasy running backs right now. And then Tony Pollard and J.K. Dobbins are both top 24 running backs. So hopefully you've been stashing some depth on your bench to get through this week if you have any of these guys. And if that isn't bad enough, Thursday Night Football is going to bring us a couple of running backs that unfortunately are just underperforming this season. Moving forward, Rachaad White can only be viewed as a flex candidate. Bucky Irving is absolutely killing his snap percentage right now. And Rachaad White was a must avoid in the draft guide for me this season. And I even called this. If he was not more efficient this season than what we've seen the last 2 years, he was not going to get the amount of touches to help overshadow that and be a top tier fantasy contributor. And now it's here and it's happening. Rachaad White last season, he saw over 80% of the running back snaps almost every single week. This year, his snap percentage is all the way down to 53%. And Bucky Irving has been way better in terms of efficiency. And included in all that is the fact that Bucky Irving is getting half the goal line snaps now. So Rachaad White's touchdown upside has also started to disappear. Now I could see Rachaad White surviving at least another week with a split backfield. There's a good opportunity for him to get some passing work in this game going up against Atlanta, who has been very strong on defense to begin the season, but his upside on the ground just isn't going to be there. And he is one bad game away from becoming virtually impossible to start. Tyler Allgeier saw a big jump in his participation in the game plan in week 4, and it's really not that surprising given the way Bijan has been largely inefficient to begin the season. Now, is Bijan going to be sat for us at this point? No, because there's still not a whole lot of running backs that are seeing the field as often as Bijan is, even though he's losing snaps to Tyler Allgeier now. But unfortunately, Bijan is just not a first-round value. Bijan's path to top 12 potential this week has to come through in the passing game, and that absolutely could happen going up against the Tampa Bay Bucks. But Tyler Allgeier, even though he's a high risk, he should be viewed as a potential flex option if you're dealing with issues at the running back position and you've got a lot of guys on bye this week. In fact, I'm heading on over to Underdog, and I'm going to take his current line of 31.5 rushing yards and go higher than that. Right now, Tampa Bay's defense has allowed 351 rushing yards to opposing running backs, and it could definitely be worse. But the biggest problem is they've done that on only 69 rushing attempts by their opponents. They're allowing over 5 yards per carry right now, and Tyler Allgeier currently has a career high, averaging over 6 yards per carry. Over the last 3 weeks, Tyler Allgeier has seen 9, 7, and 8 rushing attempts. So if you take a look at the yards that he's averaging right now at 6.1, and let's bump it down to what Tampa Bay is giving up at 5 yards per carry. Right now, Tyler Allgeier would only need 6 rushing attempts at 5 yards per carry to go over 31.5 rushing yards. So I'm going to go ahead and lock in Tyler Allgeier on Underdog at 31.5 rushing yards. And if you need someone for the flex this week, maybe Tyler Allgeier doesn't have the highest ceiling in the world, but he could have a pretty decent floor, because if he sees anywhere from 6 to 10 carries, he could give you anywhere from 5 to 10 fantasy points. I'm not really sure what's going on with Breece Hall, but the dude was absolutely electric with a worse offense last season than he was this year, and now it just feels like he can't find a hole to save his life. And after a really bad performance last week, he's got a tough matchup going up against Minnesota, who allows the 4th fewest rushing yards and 5th fewest fantasy points to the running back position. Now, even though Braylon Allen has started to see more and more work and has become flex viable, Breece Hall is still the RB1 on this Jets team. Breece Hall is the starter. He's coming out and playing the most snaps to begin the game, but it seems like the New York Jets want to give him more rest as the game goes on. So then when you get to the middle portions of the game, Braylon Allen is starting to see more snaps than Breece Hall, and then Breece Hall may come in at the end, especially if the Jets can find themselves with a lead. Really, they're trying this balancing act where Breece Hall's not seeing more than 50 to 60% of the running back snaps per game, which stinks for his fantasy value because he's not being super efficient right now. Breece Hall is going to be a medium risk this week. He's going to have to try and find the end zone, and he's going to have to see a decent amount of work in the passing game. But that could definitely still hold up if he's the number one running back. Braylon Allen becomes far riskier because he's going to need to rely on his efficiency while getting fewer touches than Breece Hall. And if that ends up being the case, it's going to be really, really tough to be ultra efficient going up against Minnesota. Aaron Jones has been fantastic this season, and going up against the Jets this week, it's not going to be easy for him. Right now, the Jets are allowing quite a few rushing yards to opposing running backs, which is good for Aaron Jones's potential floor. But they've only allowed one rushing touchdown so far. The Jets are also allowing the 8th fewest receiving yards to the running back position. So right now, overall fantasy points are still on the lower side for opposing running backs, even though the Jets are giving up a decent amount of yards. Aaron Jones this week is going to need to find a little bit of work in the passing game. His floor should still be super solid, especially if he can pick up the amount of yards that the Jets continue to give up. But if he's not getting bigger plays in the receiving game and he doesn't score a touchdown, top 12 potential and even top 15 potential could be hard to come by. Chuba Hubbard has been an absolute steal for fantasy owners if you've put him in your lineup the last couple of weeks. He's on fire right now, and he's got an opportunity this week going up against the Chicago Bears to find the end zone once again. Right now, the Bears are tied for the second most rushing touchdowns allowed. And if Andy Dalton can just find a way to get the Carolina Panthers into the red zone, Chuba Hubbard has a decent shot to find the end zone once again. Now, he may not have a huge ceiling this week because yards overall may be tough to come by, especially if there's a negative game script. But if he can have a decent day on the ground and find the end zone, his floor should be super solid. Now, it feels like nobody's talking about Chuba Hubbard, who now has back-to-back 100-yard games because everyone thinks Jonathan Brooks is going to come back and automatically make a huge impact. That's not the case. This is his first week back of practicing, and Carolina has already said that they are going to be cautious with Jonathan Brooks this season. If Chuba Hubbard's performing, there's no reason to throw Jonathan Brooks into the mix right away, given the fact that he's coming off a pretty major knee injury. Let Chuba Hubbard go ahead and run, and Brooks may still be several weeks away from making any type of an impact on the game. So for right now, continue to roll out with Chuba Hubbard, and then at some point, we'll sell high on his fantasy value and get a haul in return. Over the course of DeAndre Swift's first 3 games this season, he totaled 16.4 fantasy points. From an overall volume and efficiency perspective, he was one of, if not the worst starting running back in all of football through the first 3 weeks of the regular season. And then out of nowhere, he pops off for 26 fantasy points last week. So all that talk about Roschon Johnson getting more looks by the coaching staff clearly wasn't the case. And DeAndre Swift is going to be a medium risk for me this week because he absolutely could come crashing back to earth and see some of the same type of production he did the first 3 weeks of the season. But this is a really good matchup going up against Carolina, who are currently allowing the most fantasy points, rushing yards, and rushing touchdowns to the running back position. So if you own DeAndre Swift, especially with the buys this week, go ahead and fire him up. He should be in your lineup, and if he comes crashing down, that really sucks. But hopefully he doesn't, and he gives us a really solid fantasy week for our lineups. Everybody out there that was telling their viewers to skip on Derrick Henry this season really are feeling the effects of an absolutely devastatingly bad call. The floor was great with Derrick Henry the entire time. Even if he didn't see the volume that we were used to in Tennessee, the chance to score every single week was going to be very high. And that alone made him one of the the safest bets at the running back position, especially considering the fact his ADP was pushed out into the 3rd round in most drafts. And now, not only did we see that floor in weeks 1 and 2, but weeks 3 and 4, we have started to see an absolutely incredible ceiling for him. And it's clear that Derrick Henry hasn't lost a step. Based on the NFL's next gen stats, Derrick Henry was only 0.75 miles per hour slower on his touchdown run this past week than what Xavier Worthy was on his touchdown reception. That's right, Derrick Henry's in-game speed was almost exactly the same as Xavier Worthy's. The dude hasn't lost a step. He's a touchdown threat every single week. Heck, he's a multiple touchdown threat every single week. And Derrick Henry, regardless of the matchup, has a safe floor and should be locked into your lineup, knowing that he also has huge RB1 upside to go with it. Now, if you're stopping by to ask about Justice Hill because you're thinking about him as a flex option, I would be cautious about trying to do that. He had some flex appeal in week 1, didn't really do anything in weeks 2 and 3, and a little bit more flex appeal in week 4. However, a lot of it is going to be game dependent. Yes, he could definitely see some passing work, but it really depends on if Baltimore is getting out in front or not. This past week, Baltimore got out in front, and Justice Hill saw a few more touches because Derrick Henry didn't need any more touches. If anything stays neutral, especially in a game like this, Justice Hill probably isn't going to see much of anything. Right now, the Baltimore Ravens are allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points and 2nd fewest rushing yards to the running back position. So we may want to jump on Chase Brown after last week, and I agree. I think he's got bigger things to come this season. Now, there has been a little bit of a shift in the way Zach Moss and Chase Brown are being used. Zach Moss has shifted to more of the receiving role, and in this matchup against Baltimore, especially if Cincinnati's defense doesn't show up, they could be behind and Zach Moss may be on the field a little bit more often. Whereas Chase Brown this past week has shifted to a role that shows him more work on the early down of drives. But Chase Brown has also seen more short yardage situations over the last couple of weeks as well. And his 2 touchdown runs from this past week show that when they get into the red zone, Chase Brown could end up being that guy. Now, Zach Moss also scored, but his was on a passing play and he caught that receiving touchdown. So this week, Zach Moss has a little bit of a better floor for me. And what could end up being a negative game script against Baltimore, Zach Moss may be on the field a little bit more often, and that is what you would need. Chase Brown, however, really relies on a lot of his efficiency. He's one of the most efficient running backs in all the NFL right now. And if you've been watching your members only videos, we talked about Chase Brown as being a guy that you should be going out and trading for in a members only video last week, because the dynamic running back rating that we have here, that we utilize the ability to find high upside running backs and breakout running backs, all offseason long, it told us Chase Brown had a really good shot, and this season it's been saying the same thing. So if you used that video last week and you went out and got Chase Brown, awesome. This week may not be a great matchup for him, but moving forward, I expect Chase Brown to be a big part of our fantasy lineups. Unfortunately, until Tua is healthy, the Miami Dolphins are all a high-risk team, and that's going to include De'Von Achane, who owners are desperately pleading for some bigger games to come here shortly. And going up against the New England Patriots, who allow the 4th most rushing touchdowns, he definitely could find the end zone. But are they even going to be able to get the ball into the red zone? Because right now, New England is allowing the 9th fewest rushing yards overall. When the Dolphins played the Bills, Achane averaged over 4.4 yards per carry in that matchup, but he hasn't been able to average over 3 yards per carry in any other game this season. Now, some of that is absolutely on the quarterback position, and when Tua comes back, he could end up being way more efficient, and we could have a great stretch run of some high leverage games from De'Von Achane. But part of the issue as well is that he's not being utilized in the passing game while they're struggling at the quarterback position. Over the last 2 weeks, he's only combined for 8 targets. And right now, we don't really know who the starting quarterback is going to be heading into week 5. Raheem Mostert is still hurt though, and now Jeff Wilson saw a knee injury that limited his potential this past week. Jalen Wright saw a few more touches and a few more snaps than what he had to begin the season, but he really, for me, is kind of a depth stash right now that's really only being kept in dynasty leagues. If you're holding on to him in redraft leagues, I don't hate it as long as you have a bigger roster and the room to do so. But Devon Achane until Tua comes back is definitely a risky play. Yeah, Ramondre Stevenson needs to clean up the fumbles. He has one fumble in every game this season. However, I do think he gets back on track this week. He had 2 huge games to start the year, one really bad performance in week 3, a tough matchup against San Francisco in week 4, but now against Miami, I do believe that Ramondre Stevenson should be my Manscaped must-start player of the week for the running back position. It's crazy. I was talking to my son earlier today and we could not believe that it's already October. There's only 3 months left in the year, which means it's time to start doing some holiday shopping. And you can get started with your holiday shopping over on Manscaped. And if you find anything over there from their line of great tools at manscaped.com, use code word headliners20 at checkout. That's going to get you 20% off the entire order and free shipping. And they have a ton of stuff that you can wrap and put under the tree or put in somebody's stocking. Right now, the Miami Dolphins are allowing the most rushing touchdowns, the 4th most fantasy points, and the 9th most rushing yards to the running back position. So this is absolutely the matchup that Ramondre Stevenson can thrive in. Plus, it's got a great opportunity to be positive game script for him because Miami can't move the ball to save their lives right now. If this New England defense can shut down Miami and they just focus on running the football, Ramondre Stevenson has top 10 potential this week, if not top 5. And on top of that, Antonio Gibson in PPR leagues has some additional value as well, because if for some reason there is a larger lead or a longer positive game script for New England, we could see some more snaps from Antonio Gibson. And he's got the potential to put together a solid day as well, even if those points don't come until later in the game. But back to Ramondre Stevenson, over on Underdog, his current rushing line is set at 58.5 rushing yards. I'm absolutely going to hammer higher on that. This could be a big day for Ramondre Stevenson, not only for your fantasy teams, but for your underdog tickets as well. Now, Jerome Ford may not be seeing a ton of carries, and a lot of his work may come when Cleveland is in a positive game script. But going up against Washington this week, that currently allows the 4th most rushing yards to running backs, hopefully Jerome Ford has a little bit more upside for us. Now, I don't believe that Cleveland is going to have a ton of positive game script in this matchup. In fact, it's probably going to be more neutral than anything. And because of that, hopefully Jerome Ford sees some work in the passing game this week. And if he doesn't see a ton of work on the ground, hopefully he's pretty efficient with the touches that he gets, puts it all together, and maybe he doesn't have top 20 potential, but maybe he's just on the outside looking in of that RB2 status and gives you a decent flex floor. Brian Robinson continues to thrive in this new offensive scheme. And Austin Ekeler, prior to his concussion, was still getting some touches, but it's really promising to see the Washington Commanders realize that Brian Robinson is their guy, and they're putting him out on the field quite often. In fact, right now, Brian Robinson is one of only 6 running backs to have at least 10 half PPR points in every single game this season. Now, this could end up being a tougher matchup this week, especially depending on which Cleveland defense decides to show up. But we know Washington has the ability to get the ball into the red zone. If they do, Brian Robinson has touchdown potential. And we know Washington utilizes Brian Robinson in the passing game. Austin Ekeler may not end up being back this week. It could be Jeremy McNichols once again. And if it is Brian Robinson, even though his ceiling isn't super high, we should still feel pretty good about his floor. Now, the Indianapolis Colts section is going to greatly depend on what news we hear about Jonathan Taylor over the next few days. As of right now, it appears that Jonathan Taylor will miss some time. It is a mild sprain of his ankle, but it is an ankle that he's had issues with so far in the NFL, and it appears to be a high sprain, which is a lot tougher to play through than a lower sprain. Keep an eye on what happens with Jonathan Taylor. If he doesn't end up playing, Trey Sermon is going to be the running back this week. And unless you're desperate for a flex option, I'm probably not rolling with him. Jacksonville is currently allowing the 8th fewest rushing yards to opposing running backs. Now, that may be because you can throw all over the Jacksonville Jags and they can't stop it. But in terms of the passing game, they do allow quite a few passing yards to running backs. So maybe that's where Sermon could end up making his mark. But a lot of it also depends on Anthony Richardson, who we also don't know if he would be playing this week. Keep an eye on the update videos throughout the week, Jake's ranking videos, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later in the week when the doc gets his video out on Friday. But as of right now, there's a lot of things that need clarifying for the Indianapolis Colts. The Indianapolis Colts are allowing the 5th most rushing yards to running backs right now, but they've only allowed 1 rushing touchdown. Is that because they truly get better in the red zone against running backs, or is that because teams just have way more success throwing the ball against them and they just roll with it? But there's still a lot to figure out for this matchup for the Jags as well, because Travis Etienne is apparently dealing with a shoulder injury that kept him off the field at times last week. And we saw Tank Bigsby be highly successful with the few touches that he got. As of right now, both of them are considered a medium risk for me, and that's because I really don't know how the situation is going to play out this week. If they both end up playing and Travis Etienne is okay and he gets some touches, he's got potential, and so does Tank Bigsby, but it really hurts the ceiling for both of them. And what if they end up rolling with the hot hand and Travis Etienne is banged up? Maybe he plays a couple of drives, but then he plays sparingly the rest of the day. This could end up being the best option this week, and it's Travis Etienne sitting. And I can't believe I'm even saying this about Tank Bigsby, but if Travis Etienne were to sit, Tank Bigsby becomes a safe option, and anybody that owns him should have him in your lineups. The Houston Texans currently allow the 10th fewest rushing yards to opposing running backs, which is already not great for James Cook and his upside this week. But what hurts it even more is that Houston also allows the 4th fewest receiving yards to running backs. That's where James Cook's ceiling really could end up falling in. And now we're looking at James Cook and we're really hoping for touchdowns this week. And we saw James Cook's floor last week. In a negative game script, he only got you 4.9 fantasy points, which is really tough to deal with. And part of the reason why over the first few weeks of the season, I've talked about why he's been so big play dependent. Now, he just didn't end up getting the amount of touches needed based on the fact that it was a negative game script, but I'm also surprised he only had 1 target the entire game. It's definitely something that we will monitor, and this matchup for Cook has a lot of issues in terms of his upside, but if they can drive the ball and get down to the goal line, James Cook still has some touchdown potential, which would really help his fantasy value and is almost needed this week. Now, I will admit, if you look at just the numbers for the Buffalo Bills, it doesn't tell the whole story. It kind of reminds me of Denver last year when they got torched by the Miami Dolphins and their defensive numbers looked like crap for the rest of the season, but actually down the stretch, they were a whole lot better. Because Buffalo got torched by Derrick Henry this past week, their run defense looks a lot worse than what it actually is. Are they as bad as they were against Baltimore last week? No, they're not. Are they as good as they have been all season long? Maybe not, but we got to find an in-between here. And if Joe Mixon can come back this week, he's got a pretty decent floor with a decent ceiling as well and the ability to find the end zone. Cam Akers hasn't been all that efficient yet since he got a couple of starts here. And if Joe Mixon misses another week, Cam Akers is like a really low upside flex option for me, whereas Joe Mixon is a guy that I see as more of an RB2 type potential. Last week, Zamir White ran for 10 less yards than what Alexander Mattison did on 12 more carries. Zamir White, awful efficiency so far this season, and essentially has been regulated to work on 1st and 2nd down. And if he's not breaking any big plays during that time frame, with Alexander Mattison being the receiving back and receiving at least half of the goal line work, Zamir White doesn't even need to be anywhere near your fantasy lineup, especially in a matchup like this. We could have a little bit more clarity for the Denver backfield now. Unfortunately, Tyler Bidet suffered an injury last week and had to be carted off the field, and he's going to be done for quite some time. So that could leave open the potential for just a 2 running back rotation right now, which we have not seen for the Broncos yet this season. And that works well for Javonte Williams, who was the clear lead back in week 4. And also, he was pretty successful with the touches that he had last week against the New York Jets of all teams. Hopefully this week in a really solid matchup, we can see some of that start to come back, and Javonte Williams starts to find himself in some better and better fantasy positions throughout the rest of the season. James Conner going up against San Francisco doesn't give us the highest ceiling matchup that we would love, but it also doesn't present the biggest obstacle either. James Conner has seen at least 16 carries in 3 of his 4 games this season. The only game he didn't see that was against the Detroit Lions, who stop every running back in the world except for Kenneth Walker. So the hope is that Arizona at least maintains a neutral game script for a majority of the game against San Francisco. If they do that, then James Conner definitely has RB2 potential this week. If he scores, he probably gets closer to that 14 or 15 range, but realistically, knowing that Arizona probably goes down at some point in time, he's a guy that's just limited in terms of upside. Arizona is currently allowing the 3rd most rush yards and 5th most fantasy points to the running back position. Really, the only thing I can say about Jordan Mason, everyone around him is healthy, which locks him into potential RB1 status this week with a top 10 upside. Let me just tell you off the bat that Josh Jacobs should be locked in as a top 5 running back this week that is going to challenge for the top overall running back position. I mean, the Los Angeles Rams are allowing the most rushing yards to running backs now after allowing DeAndre Swift, who couldn't figure out how to run a football over the first 3 weeks of the season, to absolutely tear them apart. Josh Jacobs has a ton of ceiling to go along with a really great floor this week. And while Josh Jacobs will be running all over the Los Angeles Rams, let's run ourselves on over to Underdog and go higher than the 64.5 rushing yard line that's currently set there. Kyren Williams, unfortunately, doesn't have nearly that potential with a much tougher matchup across from him in Green Bay's defense. But he's still a low-risk candidate at the running back position because he basically plays more snaps and gets more touches than almost any running back out there. And we know that if they can get into the red zone and near the goal line, that Kyren Williams is almost a lock to score every single week. Is he a top 12 running back this week? Probably not, but if he can find the end zone, which they seem to do plenty, based on the volume he will get, he should still find his way inside the top 20. The Seattle Seahawks have one of the most explosive offenses in all of football. It is really hard to try and contain all 3 of those wide receivers and Kenneth Walker when he is healthy. So this week for the New York Giants, the goal is going to need to be keep them off the field as much as possible. And you do that by running the football because Daniel Jones isn't going to be able to do that through the air, and the turnover potential is way too high. Does Devin Singletary have a ton of upside this week? Absolutely not. But if he gets any less than 10 rushing attempts, the New York Giants have failed miserably. Run the football, keep Seattle's offense off of the field, try and keep this game script as neutral as possible, and don't go down by big numbers to them, because if you do, now you become one-dimensional and Devin Singletary absolutely sucks. Singletary may only be like an RB3 this week because I don't know if he finds the end zone, but he definitely should see more than enough touches to give you an okay floor to be in your lineup. It has been almost a year since the Detroit Lions allowed that type of a rushing performance to an opposing running back. Gus Edwards with 3 rushing touchdowns against them on the road early last season is the last time I remember a running back truly going off. Kenneth Walker had 3 more touchdowns, and he ran for over 80 yards, and they were hard-fought yards against a Detroit defense that does a great job against the run. It is great to see Kenneth Walker back. It is great to have him back in our lineup, and going up against the New York Giants, he should be a really safe start once again. The Pittsburgh Steelers have one of the biggest question marks of the week that need to be answered on Sunday Night Football. After being one of the most dominant defenses the first 3 weeks of the season, they absolutely took a step back against the Indianapolis Colts. So is that the true Pittsburgh defense, or will they get back to being dominant? The Dallas Cowboys backfield is one to almost completely avoid at this point in time, especially if it becomes a game where negative game script is involved. If you haven't dropped Zeke Elliott as of yet, you need to do so now because his fantasy value is absolutely cooked. Rico Dowdle is the starting running back though, so he has the most touchdown potential of the group, and the reason why he's a medium risk as of right now. But if Pittsburgh's defense is as good as they were the first 3 weeks and Dallas has a hard time moving the football, Rico Dowdle becomes a guy that loses a ton of value. Hunter Luepke, who is the fullback for the Dallas Cowboys, actually played more snaps and ran more routes than Rico Dowdle last week, and now becomes a guy that we may need to seriously keep an eye on if the Dallas Cowboys continue to play in a negative game script. And if that happens this week, I would not be shocked if Luepke once again sees anywhere from 3 to 5 fantasy points based on receiving work alone. The Dallas defense feels almost Jekyll and Hyde at this point. After allowing over 460 total rushing yards combined between weeks 2 and 3, they only allowed 26 total rushing yards in week 4. Najee Harris is a mid-risk this week based solely on the fact that Cordero Patterson and Jaylen Warren could both be missing, so he would essentially have the backfield to himself. However, he continues to be largely inefficient once again, and because of that, it really hurts his upside. And it also depends what defense shows up for Pittsburgh. If they're great again and they're in positive game script, Najee Harris starts to get a little bit closer to high-end RB2. However, if they're trailing or in neutral game script and they're needing to pass more often, then that becomes an issue and leads Najee Harris to top 24 upside at best. Is Alvin Kamara on Monday Night Football really a medium risk? No, he's probably closer to being low risk, but the Kansas City Chiefs do allow the second fewest rushing yards and second fewest fantasy points to the running back position. So really, I just want to prepare you for the fact that some of the ceiling that we've seen with Kamara so far this season may not entirely be here this week. Casey also does a pretty good job of limiting running backs in the passing game as well. So there is a chance that he's kept out of the end zone, he's limited through the air, and unfortunately, he doesn't see the most efficient day on the ground. Now, he's closer to low risk because we already know at this point he's going to see a ton of volume and he will see some work in the passing game. But if we're missing that touchdown and those big plays, then we're probably looking at a guy that may have better chances of landing inside the top 24 than he does inside the top 12. But really, all it takes is that touchdown or that one big play to make him an RB1 for the week, especially considering the volume he'll probably have. Unfortunately, after another fumble, Carson Steele has probably seen the end of his starting work as the running back for the Kansas City Chiefs. Kareem Hunt is back on the roster, he is active, and he had a really solid day last week. But Hunt doesn't have tremendous upside. That's because Samaje Perine is going to see a lot of work as well. Both Hunt and Perine need to be heavily utilized this week though, and they both have fantasy value because of a near 50-50 split and the fact that Kansas City is just dealing with a bunch of injuries. Rashee Rice and Marquise Brown are both down for the count, and Xavier Worthy has wide receiver 1 potential, but he's still going through some of those rookie growing pains. So run the football with Kareem Hunt, get Samaje Perine going in the passing game, give us 2 running backs that have RB3 potential and that we could flex with about a ceiling of 10 fantasy points. And if one of them ends up finding the end zone against a tough New Orleans defense, then that just ends up being icing on the cake. Not a ton of ceiling, but at least it's somebody that we can utilize in our lineup if we're having trouble filling it up this week. Yo, Headliner Nation, a little bit of a shorter video this week. We're missing 2 matchups because we've got 4 teams on a bye, but a lot of those bye weeks are going to start firing up very soon. So hopefully you've been enforcing your lineup with enough depth to cover all of those guys. But for now, Headliner Nation, I'm gonna go ahead and bounce and start working on the other videos as well. Hopefully you all got a ton of information about running backs that you need to set your lineup this week. Have a great rest of the day, stay safe and stay healthy, and I'll catch you on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.